15 years of silence ended the moment Ethan opened an old wooden box, filled with letters from the girl he never stopped loving. The old house stood at the edge of a quiet lake where the wind always seemed to whisper forgotten memories through the tall pine trees. Every evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, the water reflected soft shades of gold and blue, making the world feel slower and gentler. Ethan had not returned to this place in nearly 15 years. Life had carried him to busy cities, endless workdays, and countless faces, but somehow none of those places had ever felt like home. After his grandfather passed away, the old cabin became his responsibility. It was smaller than he remembered, and time had painted every wooden wall with the marks of countless seasons. Dust floated gently through the warm afternoon light as he pushed open the front door. The familiar scent of old books, cedar wood, and the fireplace instantly reminded him of childhood summers that had once seemed endless. He spent hours cleaning shelves, folding faded blankets, and opening windows that had remained closed for years. Every room carried a memory, but one memory quietly followed him more than any other. Emily. She had lived in the white cottage across the lake. Every summer they spent together felt like a chapter from a story that neither of them wanted to end. They collected smooth stones along the shore, skipped them across the water, watched fireflies dance after sunset, and dreamed about the lives they would have one day. Back then, love was not something either of them understood. It was simply the comfort of never wanting the day to end if the other person was there. As evening settled over the lake, Ethan walked into the dusty attic. His grandfather had always said that the attic held treasures for anyone patient enough to search. Old fishing rods leaned against the wall beside cracked picture frames and worn-out trunks covered with faded travel stickers. Near the smallest window sat a wooden box unlike anything else in the room. It was beautifully carved with tiny flowers and birds, its surface darkened by age but carefully preserved. A small brass lock hung from the front, though it had already rusted open long ago. Curious, Ethan carried the box downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. The soft light from an old lamp illuminated every detail. Inside were neatly folded letters tied together with a pale blue ribbon. Their edges had turned slightly yellow, but each envelope remained untouched. His heart slowed when he noticed the handwriting. It was Emily's. The elegant curves of every letter looked exactly as he remembered from the notes she used to leave inside his favorite books. For a long moment he simply stared, unable to breathe properly. He had not seen her handwriting since the day she disappeared from the lake without saying goodbye. Every envelope had his name written across the front. Ethan. None of them had stamps. None of them had ever been mailed. Outside, gentle rain began tapping against the cabin windows, creating a peaceful rhythm that filled the silence. Ethan carefully untied the ribbon, his hands trembling more than he expected. The first envelope rested on top of the others. Across the corner Emily had written a single sentence in tiny letters. "If you are reading this, then time has finally brought you home." He slowly opened the envelope, afraid that even the smallest movement might somehow erase the fragile connection between the present and the past. The paper carried the faint scent of lavender, almost impossible to notice after so many years, yet somehow still alive. Before he could read the first line, a folded photograph slipped onto the table. It showed two children sitting on the old wooden dock with their feet hanging above the water. Ethan instantly recognized himself. Beside him sat Emily, smiling brighter than the summer sun while holding a tiny glass jar filled with glowing fireflies. Written on the back of the photograph were 7 quiet words. Everything began on the longest summer evening. Ethan looked through the rain-covered window toward the lake, where the dock still stood exactly where it had always been. The memories he had buried for years slowly returned, one gentle wave at a time. Somewhere within those unopened letters waited the story he had never known, and perhaps the answer to the question that had followed him through every lonely year since Emily vanished without a goodbye. Ethan held the photograph for a long time, tracing the faded edges with his fingertips while the rain continued to fall outside. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackling of the fireplace, a sound that somehow made the silence feel warm instead of lonely. He finally unfolded the letter, taking a slow breath before reading the first words Emily had written all those years ago. Dear Ethan. If this letter has found you, then the lake has remembered us before we remembered ourselves. I often wonder if places can miss people the way people miss each other. I believe they can. Every tree, every wave, every quiet evening here still knows our names. Ethan smiled without realizing it. Emily had always believed ordinary things carried hidden feelings. She talked to flowers as if they listened and thanked the stars before making a wish. As children, he had laughed at those little habits, but deep inside he had admired the kindness that seemed to live in every part of her heart. The words continued. Do you remember the first summer we met? I was 10 years old, frightened of a place that felt too quiet. My parents had just bought the white cottage across the lake. Everything was unfamiliar until I saw a boy sitting alone on the dock, skipping stones across the water. You looked up, smiled, and waved as though we had already been friends for years. The memory returned with perfect clarity. It had been one of the longest evenings of June. The sun refused to disappear, stretching golden light across the lake. Ethan had noticed a girl standing near the trees, holding a worn teddy bear close to her chest. She looked uncertain, almost ready to turn around and go home. Without thinking, he had walked over and held out a smooth flat stone. Want me to teach you how to make it fly? Emily had stared at the stone for a second before nodding shyly. Her first throw had landed with a tiny splash. The second bounced once. The third skipped 4 times across the water, and she laughed so loudly that birds flew from the nearby branches. That laugh became the sound Ethan waited for every summer morning. Emily's letter brought him deeper into those memories. After that day, I stopped being afraid. We explored every corner of the forest together. We believed the tallest pine tree was home to friendly giants. We named every path, every rock, and every little island we could reach by canoe. We promised that if we ever became lost, we would always meet at the dock before sunset. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered building tiny boats from fallen branches and leaves. They had placed little notes inside them before letting the current carry them away. One note had read, "I hope we stay friends forever." Another had simply said, "Tomorrow will be another adventure." Back then, forever had seemed like such a simple promise. Emily's handwriting became softer near the bottom of the page. There is one memory I never told you about. One evening, while you were watching the fireflies, I looked at you and realized something had quietly changed inside me. I didn't know the word for it then. I only knew that every happy memory I imagined somehow included you. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow. He remembered that same evening. The sky had been filled with stars, and hundreds of tiny lights floated above the grass like little pieces of the night sky drifting through the air. Emily had fallen asleep beside him on an old blanket while they waited to count shooting stars. He had carefully placed his jacket over her shoulders so she would not wake up cold. She never knew. Or perhaps, she had. The final lines of the letter seemed almost like a whisper. Some stories begin with grand adventures. Ours began with a smile, a skipping stone, and a quiet promise beside the water. I didn't know then how much that promise would one day mean. If you're still reading these letters, then there are things you deserve to know. But before I tell you why I left, you need to remember how deeply we once belonged to this place, and to each other. Ethan carefully folded the letter and looked toward the window. The rain had stopped. Moonlight shimmered across the calm lake, turning the old dock into a silver path reaching into the darkness. Somewhere beyond the quiet water stood the white cottage where Emily had once laughed without fear, and where the answers to 15 years of silence were waiting inside the next unopened letter. The second letter rested quietly in Ethan's hands while the moonlight spilled across the wooden table. He hesitated for a moment, almost afraid that every answer he had searched for would bring even greater questions. The blue ribbon lay beside the remaining envelopes, and for the first time in years, he felt as though the past was no longer hiding from him. It was patiently waiting, one page at a time. He unfolded the next letter with careful hands. Dear Ethan, by the time you read this, I hope you still remember the little traditions we created together. I hope you remember how every Sunday morning we raced to the dock before the sun was fully awake. The winner always claimed the smoothest stone from the shore, even though we secretly collected them for each other. Ethan smiled. He remembered pretending to run slower just to watch Emily celebrate another victory. She would lift the tiny stone above her head like a priceless treasure before slipping it into the pocket of her blue jacket. She still believed he had never noticed. The letter continued. The older we became, the more the summers changed. We were no longer children searching for imaginary kingdoms in the forest. We talked about real dreams instead. You wanted to become an architect because you loved building things that lasted. I wanted to become a writer because I believed words could keep people together, even when life tried to pull them apart. The memory settled gently inside him. They were 16 that summer. Almost every evening ended on the dock, watching the sunset melt into the quiet lake. They spoke about colleges, future jobs, and the cities they hoped to visit one day. Yet no matter how far their dreams reached, both of them always ended the conversation with the same promise. We'll come back here. Back then, it sounded so simple. Emily's handwriting grew softer. There was one evening I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. You probably thought it was ordinary. To me, it became the moment everything changed. Ethan searched his memory. Then he found it. It had been late August. The annual Lantern Festival had filled the lake with hundreds of floating lights. Families laughed along the shore while gentle music drifted through the warm night air. Ethan and Emily had borrowed a tiny wooden boat and paddled away from the crowd until they reached the quiet center of the lake. The lanterns surrounded them like glowing stars resting on the water. Emily had whispered, "Do you ever wish time could stop?" Without thinking, Ethan answered, "Only on days like this." She smiled but looked away before he could notice the tears beginning to gather in her eyes. Back in the present, Ethan continued reading. I wanted to tell you that I loved you. The words reached my lips 100 times that night, but fear always arrived first. I was terrified that if I spoke them aloud, everything beautiful between us might disappear. So instead, I smiled, and let the silence answer for me. Ethan closed his eyes. His chest tightened. He remembered that silence perfectly. He had wanted to tell her the exact same thing. Instead, he had asked whether she wanted more hot chocolate when they returned to shore. Both of them had hidden behind ordinary words. The letter went on. People always say that love changes everything. I think silence changes even more. Silence slowly builds invisible walls until two people standing side by side begin believing they are miles apart. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the pine trees. The branches swayed with the same peaceful rhythm Ethan remembered from those endless summers. He reached the final page. Then autumn arrived. My father received an unexpected job offer in another state. At first, my parents said we would only leave for a few months. I believed them. I thought I would see you again before winter ended. I planned to tell you everything before we left. I even wrote the words down because I knew I wouldn't be brave enough to say them aloud. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Folded neatly inside the letter was a small piece of paper. Only 5 handwritten words appeared across its center. I have always loved you. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken conversations. A tear rolled quietly down Ethan's cheek. For 15 years he had believed he had imagined what existed between them. Now he knew the truth. She had loved him too. But the letter was not finished. At the bottom of the page, Emily had added one final sentence. What happened the morning I tried to give you this note is the reason I disappeared without saying goodbye, and it is the hardest story I have ever had to write. Ethan carefully folded the paper and stared toward the old white cottage across the lake. Its windows were dark. Its porch stood empty. Yet somehow, for the first time since Emily had vanished, he felt closer to her than ever before. The third envelope remained on the table, waiting patiently to reveal the morning that had changed both of their lives forever. Ethan didn't touch the next envelope for several minutes. It sat in front of him like something fragile enough to break just by being understood. The cabin was silent again, but not the peaceful kind of silence he used to know as a child. This silence felt heavier, filled with all the words that had been left unsaid for too long. Finally, he opened it. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this letter, then I need you to understand something before anything else. What you believe happened that morning is not the full truth. I left the lake thinking I had lost you, but that was only the beginning of why I disappeared from your life completely. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. His chest tightened. There was something different in her tone now, less like memory, more like confession. The letter continued. After I returned home that day, I told myself I would be fine. I told my parents I was just sad about leaving the lake. But the truth is, I was not okay. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every sound reminded me of you. Even silence reminded me of you. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, throwing moving shadows across the walls. We moved 2 days later. A new city. A new house. A new school. But I stayed the same inside. I kept thinking about that morning again and again, replaying it until I started believing I had made everything up between us. But then something happened that I never told anyone. Ethan's fingers tightened around the paper. The rain began again outside, light at first, tapping gently on the roof like distant footsteps. 3 weeks after we moved, I received a call from the hospital. The word seemed to stop Ethan's breathing for a second. He read it again. Hospital. The letter continued, slower now, as if every sentence cost her strength to write. My mother had an accident on the highway. It happened suddenly, without warning. One moment she was driving to pick me up from school, and the next moment everything in my life changed again. Ethan sat completely still. The cabin felt smaller. She survived, but she was badly injured. For months, I stayed between school and hospital rooms. I stopped thinking about myself. I stopped thinking about writing to you. I stopped thinking about everything except trying to keep my family together. And in that silence, I lost the courage to come back to you. Ethan lowered his gaze. So it wasn't just distance. It wasn't just misunderstanding. It was life pulling her away piece by piece. The letter continued. There were nights I almost wrote to you. I even held the pen above the paper. But every time I started, I stopped again. Because what could I even say? That I left without explanation? That I misunderstood everything? That I ruined the only thing that ever felt real to me? A soft breath escaped Ethan's lips, almost like a broken laugh without humor. Years of silence. Built on fear. Not betrayal. Not indifference. Fear. Emily's handwriting became slightly uneven again. I tried to convince myself that you would forget me. That it would be easier for you that way. I told myself you deserved someone who stayed, not someone who kept disappearing when life became difficult. But I was wrong. Ethan's eyes softened. The rain outside grew steadier, filling the quiet cabin with a rhythm like distant waves. Because I never forgot you. Not for a single day. A pause followed in the letter, a space that felt heavier than words. Then came the line that made Ethan's hands go completely still. And I know now that you didn't forget me either, because something happened last year that made me start writing these letters again." Ethan's heart skipped. Last year. His mind raced, searching through nothing but uncertainty. Emily continued. "I saw your name in a newspaper article online. A local architectural project near the lake. A restoration plan for an old lakeside area. I almost didn't believe it was you, but I knew your handwriting in the project notes. I would recognize it anywhere." Ethan slowly looked toward the table where sketches and papers from his recent work still lay scattered. He had been here. Close. So close. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. We had both been living, but in completely separate versions of the same world. Only a few miles apart, yet still unreachable. The letter's final lines were softer. That is when I started writing these letters again. Not because I expected forgiveness. Not because I expected anything at all. But because some stories are not meant to end in silence. Ethan placed the letter down gently. Outside, the lake reflected the night sky like a dark mirror, endless and calm. And for the first time since he had opened the box, he realized the truth was no longer buried in the past. It was still unfolding. Ethan didn't move for a long time after finishing the fourth letter. The rain had stopped again, but the world outside still looked wet and quiet, as if it had been holding its breath with him. The cabin felt different now, not haunted by memories, but filled with something more complicated. Understanding, mixed with regret, mixed with a strange kind of hope he didn't know he still had. He reached for the next envelope. This one felt slightly thicker than the others. Inside was not just a letter. There were 2 pages, carefully folded together, and a small pressed flower that had long lost its color but still kept its shape. Ethan recognized it immediately. A wild blue flower that used to grow near the lake shore every summer. Emily had once told him she believed those flowers only grew where people had made a promise. He unfolded the pages. "Dear Ethan, I don't know where you are in life right now. I don't know if you are happy, or tired, or still looking at the lake sometimes without realizing why your heart feels heavy. But I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Ethan's eyes followed every word slowly, carefully, as if rushing would make him miss something important. "I came back to the lake once." His breath paused. "It was 5 years after we moved. I told myself it was just to see the place one last time. I stayed in a small town nearby for only 2 days. I didn't tell anyone from my family. I just needed to see it again." Ethan leaned forward slightly. The letter continued. The lake looked exactly the same, but also completely different. It felt smaller somehow, like it had grown older with us. I walked to the dock in the evening. The same dock where we used to sit and talk about nothing and everything at the same time. And I saw you." Ethan froze. His fingers stopped moving on the page. The room felt suddenly too quiet. "You were there, Ethan. Older. Taller. Different in the way adults become different when life teaches them how to be alone. You were sitting on the dock, looking at the water like you were searching for something that wasn't there." Ethan's mind began to blur between memory and imagination. Had that really happened? He tried to remember that year. That summer. That moment. But nothing came clearly. Only fragments. Wind. Water. Silence. I stood behind the trees for a long time, watching you. I wanted to call your name. I wanted to run to you like I used to when we were children. But I didn't. Because I saw something in your face that scared me." Ethan swallowed slowly. "You looked like someone who had learned not to expect anyone anymore." The words hit deeper than he expected. He lowered his gaze. "That night I went back to my small room and cried for the first time in years. Not because I had lost you again, but because I realized I had never truly tried to find you after I left. The pressed flower slipped slightly between the pages as he turned them. Its color had faded, but its shape remained delicate. After that visit, I told myself I would write to you. I even started a letter. But I never sent it. I told myself it was too late. That your life had already moved forward without me. I was wrong again. The next lines were written more carefully, as if she had spent a long time choosing each word. Because love does not disappear just because time passes. It only becomes quieter. And in that silence, it waits for something brave enough to bring it back. Ethan's throat tightened. Outside, the lake reflected a faint glow from the moon, trembling slightly with the movement of the wind. That is why I started collecting everything I remember. Every moment. Every feeling. Every piece of us that time tried to erase. These letters are not just memories, Ethan. They are a way back. A pause followed. Then the final part of the letter. If you are reading this and still wondering whether any of this matters anymore, then I want you to know something clearly. It matters. Because I am still here. Ethan's hand stopped completely. The sentence didn't feel like past tense. It felt present. Alive. As if she hadn't just written it. As if she meant it right now. A small note was attached at the bottom of the page, written in slightly different ink. Tomorrow, I will come to the lake again. Ethan stared at those words for a long time. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, the air heavier than before. Across the lake, the white cottage stood in darkness. Ethan could not tell how long he had been sitting there after reading the fifth letter. Time had started to feel unfamiliar, like it was moving differently inside the cabin than it did outside in the world. The clock on the wall ticked softly, but each second felt heavier than the last. Tomorrow, I will come to the lake again. Those words kept repeating in his mind, not like a sentence, but like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. He slowly placed the letter down, then looked at the remaining envelope on the table. There was only one left. It felt different from the others. Not just thicker, but more carefully sealed, as if Emily had known this would be the one that changed everything. Ethan hesitated. For the first time since opening the box, he wasn't sure he was ready. But there was no turning back now. He opened it. Dear Ethan. If you are reading this, then I am either very close to you or I have already failed to reach you again. Ethan's chest tightened. The lake outside was completely still now, as if even the water was listening. I am writing this on the night before I return to the lake. I don't know what I will find there. I don't know if you will even still be there. But I had to come back, even if only to finally stop living in the space between what was real and what I was too afraid to accept. He swallowed slowly, eyes fixed on every line. There is something I never told you properly. Not in the first letter. Not in the second. Not in any of them. A pause. When I saw you on the dock 5 years after we moved, I didn't just see a memory. I saw a life I never became part of. Ethan's hand tightened around the paper. The words felt like they were pulling him into a place he had never fully understood. I saw you laugh with someone else that day. Not in a way that looked like love, but in a way that looked like peace. And I realized something that broke me in a way I could never explain. You were surviving without me. The room felt colder. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. That wasn't what he had been feeling. Not at all. But silence had built its own version of truth. The letter continued. So I stopped trying to come back. I stopped writing. I stopped believing that I had any right to re-enter your life and disturb whatever version of happiness you had built without me. But I was wrong, Ethan. Because I finally learned something important. Love does not disappear when it is ignored. It only hides in the places we refuse to look at. And I refused to look for too long. That is my mistake, not yours. The paper trembled slightly in Ethan's hands as he read on. I don't know what you will say when you see me. I don't know if you will be angry, silent, or if you will simply look at me like a stranger standing in the shape of someone you once knew. But I am still coming to the lake. Because I need to stop living in letters. And I need to know if the boy who once sat on the dock skipping stones is still somewhere inside the man you became. There was a final pause, longer than the others. If there is even a small part of you that remembers me without pain, I will wait at the dock where it all began. Not as a memory, but as someone finally choosing to be real again. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Outside, the night felt different now. Not empty. Not silent. Waiting. Ethan sat still with the final letter resting in his hands, but he was no longer reading it. The words had already settled deep inside him, like something that could not be undone once understood. The cabin felt strangely alive now, every small sound carrying meaning, the soft creak of wood, the distant rustle of wind through pine trees, the quiet breathing of the lake outside. He stood up slowly. For the first time in years, he didn't feel pulled by memory. He felt pulled forward. The dock. That was where everything began. And apparently, where it was still waiting. Ethan walked out of the cabin without turning on any extra lights. The moon guided him like it had always done in childhood, silvering the path toward the lake. The air was cool against his skin, carrying that familiar scent of water and wood and something unspoken that he had once forgotten how to feel. Each step felt heavier and lighter at the same time. When he reached the shore, the lake opened in front of him like a quiet universe. The dock stood exactly as it always had, slightly worn, slightly uneven, but still holding the same place between land and water where time seemed to slow down. And then he saw her. At first, she was just a silhouette. Standing at the far end of the dock. Still. Waiting. Ethan stopped walking. The world around him didn't move. Even the wind felt like it paused for a moment, as if it understood this was not just another night. The figure turned slowly. And the years collapsed in an instant. Emily. She looked older, but not changed in the way strangers change. There was familiarity in her face, in the way she held herself, in the quiet hesitation behind her eyes. It was the same girl from the letters, standing at the edge of everything they had.
you.